There we go. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here today. It's really nice to see so many people, and we have more attendees coming in now. Um, we had about we had just shy of 400 people register for this, which is really awesome. So I'm really glad that everyone's here and is interested in ethics and mathematics education. My name is Alex Moore. I'm hosting the event for the Institute today, along with David Bowers, who's also one of the authors in the book. I'm in the book as well, so we'll both be talking along with several other people who are here, and you can see all of your panelists on the screen. This is a Zoom webinar, so the controls are a bit different if you're an attendee. So what you'll do is you'll use the chat, or excuse me, the Q&A feature at the bottom to ask questions, and you can direct those just to the panel or to the entire group based on what you would like, and then we can answer those when we get to the Q&A session after each of the speakers. So I think that's everything that I needed to say, and I'm going to turn it over now to our first speaker, who is the editor of the book himself, Paul Ernest of the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Paul, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a joy to be here. I'm just going to get my talk ready. And it's a joy to be sharing the platform, if you like, with some of my fellow authors. Sadly, not everyone can be here. There isn't room to have all of the 20 or 30 authors, but it's nice that you'll get a taste. So this is my little bit. First of all, something about the book. So this is the book launch for the Ethics of Mathematics Education, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And you can see I was playful with the font there, just because, well, that's the fun bit of the title in some ways. But the serious bit is the ethics bit. Oh, yeah, it did work. So the book, this is the first dedicated monograph on ethics and mathematics education. You see the title there, and indeed, hopefully we all have copies. Although Laura, one of the authors, just contacted me today, say hers hasn't arrived yet. But hopefully, all of us you'll see have hard copies of it. But it's also online. There are plenty of books on mathematics and social justice, but this book explores diversity of work on ethics in mathematics education and mathematics. It touches on that, a very important dimension of it. Ethics and mathematics education. There are articles, there's even dedicated journal issues, but this is the first book. So what we have here is that the ethical turn, which has been noted in philosophy, humanities, social sciences, which had left mathematics education and mathematics particularly behind, is now reaching mathematics education. Mathematics education's identification with mathematics has meant that it has been slow to accept the import of ethics. But clearly, teaching and learning mathematics is thoroughly entangled with issues of ethics and justice. Education, after all, is is a good for children and society. It's one of the good things we offer. One of the great, in the Beveridge Report, which was founded the welfare state in Britain just after the Second World War, there were 5 great evils that they wanted to combat. Idleness and poverty and disease. One of them was ignorance, and how you conquer ignorance is through education. But that doesn't mean that any education is good in every way for everybody, and that's where I'll be coming to that critique. There are many books on social justice, but no dedicated volume on the ethics of mathematics, and that's what we're offering. Now, something I've struggled with, and I haven't resolved, and maybe won't resolve, is the difference between ethics and social justice. I've shown a Venn diagram here where I've suggested that they certainly overlap in a much bigger way than that diagram shows. The question is social justice just a part of ethics, or are there things within social justice that exceed ethics? I put political structure, a just political structure, but when I add just, then already that brings in the good. So, that, it could be easily argued that brings the social justice in as a subset of ethics. There are parts of ethics, though, and I listed some traditional ones like mercy and charity, which are not part of social justice, but are seen to be ethical, traditional Christian and other religions' virtues. But also one can mention caring, autonomy, personal flourishing. Although once again there, people could argue that some of those are part of autonomy, maybe a part of social justice. I don't know. I'm choosing to call them separate, and certainly the focus in this book is one of ethics, that is the good, as opposed to social justice, equity, equality, etc., which we've treated much more within maths education, but is not the same thing. And if you focus on the main part of social justice, you can be overlooking some ethical issues, perhaps. Anyway, I don't think the book needs justifying. I think, there's a gap and we're filling it, beginning to fill it. So the book, the contents by section, it goes from the more theoretical to the more practical, classroom focused. We look at philosophical foundations, re-envisaging, reconceptualizing ethics and mathematics, an ethical critique of mathematical education, also ethics and social justice in mathematics, and then the role of the teacher, ethics and teachers in the teaching of mathematics, and finally ethical content in the teaching and learning of mathematics. I mean, it's all very well to talk theory, but some people want to see, we all want to see examples of what can you actually do in the classroom that encourages ethical discussions. And there are many authors, and all have made valuable contributions. And I'm sorry that I can't list them all, and we can't all present. But there are many valuable people, very valuable. All the people are valuable, and many valuable contributions that won't be referred to here. You're getting a taster, just a taster. My own contribution, chapter 12, is what I'm going to talk about now, because my role is a dual one, the kind of conductor of the orchestra in some, well, that's perhaps elevating myself a bit, but maybe the button pusher in the control room, as well as one of the voices in the choir, or in the dialogue. And my chapter 12, the ethics of authority and control in mathematics education, from naked power to hidden ideology. So I wanted to ask, what right do we have to force compulsory mathematics teaching on all children? I mean, of course, that's a subsection question of compulsory education overall. That's something in most countries, children are forced from the age of 5 or 7 to the age of 14, 15, 16 to 18 to attend schooling. And that is, and there are, it's not automatic that we should have that right. It's quite a modern thing in Britain. Education for all at the primary level came in 1870. Before that, it was much more selected for a privileged few. So what right do we have to force that? Do they all benefit? Do they all benefit? And do they all benefit all the time? Well, I'm going to say no, that some kids in many systems don't benefit all the time, and that we need to be thinking about that a bit more. It's not good enough to say, well, overall society benefits. Does every single kid, could we do better for some kids? Does society benefit? Well, of course, it's assumed society benefits because it's a big funded thing in modern societies. But wouldn't society benefit even more if every child benefited? So this chapter conducts, from one perspective, my perspective, an ethical audit of the imposed power, authority, and control in mathematics schooling. Now, the question arises, what ethical framework should I adopt? And there are many answers, and this book shows people coming at it from different perspectives. And Natalie offers quite what's the word? Iconoclastic view, combining ontology, epistemology, and ethics. And one can argue that maybe these artificial divisions by traditional departments in universities or in philosophy are cutting up something that is all more of a whole integrated piece. Personally, I'm not taking that perspective, but I think it's a very important one. So what ethical framework to adopt? And looking through the main schools of ethics, virtue ethics, consequentialism, and the other one, deontological ethics, those are quite specific, but there's applied ethics, and what's most developed in applied ethics is medical education. So I found that the applied ethics of medical ethics quite an interesting framework, I think an important framework to use. We are also in an area of applied ethics, and this for me was a good model. By the way, that's just a picture. That's not the book I used. I just thought it was a nice picture. So taking ethical values from medical ethics, there were 4 values that appealed. Looking at mathematics, they don't fit quite as well, but looking at education, they do fit. Beneficence, doing good, promoting the well-being of all the others. Non-maleficence, no harm. After all, the Hippocratic Oath starts first, do no harm. Autonomy, individual self-determination, in brackets, where this is possible in an unequal power relationship. I'm not promoting the idea of the classroom as a democratic space where everyone is equal. No, the teacher has a specific role, a specific authority. The question is, what should be the bounds of that authority, etc. And justice is the 4th value, providing the benefits equally for all. So those are the values that in my chapter I try and apply. Look, it won't come up so much in my brief talk today because I have to skip through, but I will revert to them. And I, as an interesting exercise, I did a word cloud for the chapter. It's quite fun when you've written something to submit somewhere online, I can't even remember where, and see what are the words you've used most often. By the way, I had to tamper with it. I had to delete some words because some things I didn't really want kept trying. Like you don't want, I can't remember what it was, but it was things that kind of distracted. But here you can see that mathematics and students are the big words that most often, and there's schooling, power, authority, school, and then various other words, rules, autonomy, discourse. It's chosen, however, which is interesting because it seems to leave prepositions out, but it liked, however, critical and classroom, or critical, no, I think critical and classroom are separate. Value, aims, etc. So that gives you some idea, but it's also a mishmash. So the first thing I look at is authority, and after looking at the ethics, authority in schooling. And first you have the general authority. The school is a hierarchical institution, and with levels of command, both in the staffing and the way that the staff relate to the students and other staff. Not just teachers. So I looked at general authority includes commanding compulsory school attendance, compulsory activities during their attendance. There are the powers of teachers to control student behavior, and there's the regulation of the student with respect to how they occupy and act within space, time, their appearance, their behavior, and activities imposed on them. And we're specifically interested in mathematics and teaching of mathematics. And here, the authority in mathematics dictates the mathematics curriculum, mathematical topics, mathematical tools, classroom tasks, and perhaps the most important of all in mathematics is the correctness of tasks. The teacher is as well as a social controller, is an epistemological authority determining what is correct. Not willy-nilly, not without reference to outside standards but sometimes what's the word? Idiosyncratically. I remember, for example, in biology, I was told that women don't get hemophilia because they die at the onset of their periods. And then later on, I discovered that statement by a biology teacher was completely wrong, that women don't manifest a hemophilia, but they carry the gene. And so sometimes you're taught things in school that are actually incorrect. And I'm sure the same thing happens in mathematics. I couldn't think of an example. Although there is, I suppose there are those epistemologicals, like when you're told, when you're dealing with whole numbers, that you can't divide 3 into 5. And that an initial untruth later on becomes modified, doesn't it? Because you can divide 3 into 5, and the answer is 1 2/3. So that sometimes we change the rules while we're progressing through mathematics. But so the teacher imposes correctness. Now, one of the big things I address in my chapter is ethically auditing the mathematics curriculum. And the mathematics curriculum, as I analyzed it, as 4 components, 4 overt components, and 2 covert. So the well-known overt components are the aims, why teach it, the content, what to teach, the pedagogy, how to teach it, and the assessment, how to judge successful learning. Assessment is maybe I should have really capitalized that, because unfortunately, one of my conclusions is that assessment is the tail that wags the dog. And I'll say more about assessment. But perhaps more interesting is the covert elements of the curriculum. First of all, the well-known hidden curriculum, those extra lessons learned from the discourse and practice of schooling. What children take away that isn't written down as part of the syllabus, like the story about in English lessons that the teacher says, now I want you to be as imaginative as you like in writing that essay, and then goes through them, correcting them for spelling. And once the correction tools come out, you sort of shrink in and become less creative. I'm sure we do the same in mathematics. Creativity can be knocked on the head. So the hidden curriculum, many, many things. And I'm going to argue that there are lots of elements of ideology communicated by the hidden curriculum. And that will be a big part of what I go on to say. There's also the null curriculum, which I hadn't really heard of before recently. It was Eisner who identified this. And the null curriculum is the banned and forbidden curriculum. And the example I've used, and a very common one, is that showing mathematics as political, raising ethics and critical mathematics education are in many countries, including my own, forbidden. This is unnecessary politicization of children. We know mathematics is neutral. Therefore, if you introduce these issues into mathematics, you're propagandizing them and you have a subversive agenda. Well, maybe we do have a subversive agenda, but I would defend it on the sense that we're just trying to make people into grown-up critical citizens who can evaluate and choose whether they go to the left or the right, but at least they won't be misled by fake, arguments using mathematics, or they can read through the mathematics. The null curriculum. So that is a part of what I felt you had to critique in the mathematics curriculum, as well as the overt sides. And then I mentioned ideologies within the hidden curriculum. The following alone within schooling, the necessity of obedience. Not only in school and society, but also in mathematics. There's an awful lot of authority within mathematics itself. A lot of mathematics is couched in terms of orders. The absolute certainty of mathematics, the universality of mathematics, the binary nature of mathematics, that all is right or wrong. Now, I'm not saying that every classroom in every school all around the world always emphasizes that. There are progressive classrooms where children are taught by progressive teachers not to overemphasize, that it's not as simple as right and wrong. It's, it's more complex than that. But the dominant ideology is one of right and wrong, is my claim. Another dominance is that of quantification, that there is implication that comes out that only the measurable is valuable. And that is a central part of the neoliberal ideology that now dominates in the West every domain of life, from business through to medicine. Mathematical neutrality is another ideology. Maths is beyond good and evil, and certainly not political. And this is used to support that null curriculum. The hierarchical distribution of mathematical ability. You have it or you don't. It's not universal. I'll say something later about it not being prevalent in the East, but certainly in the West, and certainly in my country, there's quite a strong notion that you've either got it or you ain't. And then the necessity of competition and success and failure in mathematics. Competition, really, you have to, I think we need to root that out, root and branch. I mean, that's not to say you can't have competition in, say, the Paralympics or something, but the notion that kids go to school and they have to compete, they really don't have to compete, because if you have competition, yes, you get winners, you get successful, but you also get losers and a failure. And that's spread throughout mathematics schooling and society. I was reading someone who was saying the good news about the old system, the old ancient monarchical aristocratic system, was at least if you're at the bottom of the heap, you knew it was hereditary privilege that kept you there. Whereas in the meritocracy, if you're at the bottom of the heap, it's your own fault. So that wasn't arguing for going back to the old ways, but it's just saying we have this blame thing that, that if you're poor, if you're unsuccessful, if you're not academic, then it's your own fault. You didn't try hard enough, or you lack whatever it is. This is a terrible thing. So there's the myth of mathematical talent. Look, Alex, can I ask you, how am I doing on time?
I think we should try to move on in the next 4 minutes or so.
Okay, that means I got 4 minutes?
I think, but by then we really should be moving to the next person. So yeah.
All right. So mathematical talent, you either have it or you don't. Competitive assessments in mathematics, I want to argue that they're really not necessary. That to give a kid 43% or C minus, maths tests are this critical filter, which are not just indicators of failure, but also harm. Mathematics provides a fractional distillation in society, giving rewards to those successful, albeit coupled with other kinds of social privilege, social capital, help to carry you through to the higher professions. But nonetheless, maths plays a key role. Alternative maths assessments are possible without competition labeling failure or losers. I'll skip my suggestion. Success for all is possible. So my conclusion is that school maths is found ethically wanting. It's beneficial for many, and it's useful in society and work, even though it's overvalued. Those are good. It's harmful for some. It's socially unjust. Some are restricted to low-level tasks, labeled as lacking, failures. That's bad. There's insufficient attention to individual needs, individual flourishing and autonomy, and the ideologies and myths are socially misleading. They help to prepare us so that when we enter society, but that many harmful uses and applications are hidden and denied, and that's ugly. So there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. What a great leader for this whole project. And it's just been a wonderful experience to learn from you through the process of working on the book together, Paul. So thank you for your talk. We'll now take questions for Paul about the book or about his chapter. And let's see, got one here. Oh, wrong one. Okay. Oh, that was just a thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Other questions for Paul? Okay, we can come back to some questions later if anyone thinks of a question. Yes, and I just got a note in the Q&A box. If you do have a question, please type it out in the Q&A button using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and where the controls are. That will send it to us. Okay, here we go. Paul, you have a question. The ethics of medicine, if medicine understood as turning wrongs into rights, seems problematic when applied to mathematics education.
Okay. Well, I think I was looking more about harm and maleficence, or no, not non-maleficence, not doing harm and doing good. Now, wrong and right. I mean, medicine doesn't, it's concerned with health and disease, but nevertheless, it seemed to me that those, and I suppose you have right diagnosis and wrong diagnoses, but that's epistemological, really, isn't it? So I just found it a useful framework. I mean, elsewhere I've written using Alistair McIntyre's virtue ethics framework, although I'm starting to have doubts about that. Just because, well, never mind. I won't sidetrack myself. Um, uh, but so I haven't got a conflict here. I don't see the problem in dealing with right and wrong, with correct, incorrect, and being concerned with the distinctions between them, and using an ethical framework from medicine, because it's fundamentally different ways of expressing the good. You know, what is beneficial, doing people good? What is non-maleficent, stopping to do harm? In other words, doing the opposite of good. Autonomy, the notion of allowing someone to flourish and become themselves as they could be, seems to me the personal good. And then justice, the notion that good is shared among equally, or as equally as we can, among everyone. I think those principles of medicine, although harder to apply to mathematics itself, certainly apply to mathematics education, where we're doing a public service. We're doing what we call a good for the students we teach. So do you want to come back on that? Because I didn't quite see the conflict.
That question was from Hienio Dominguez. We do have a couple of other questions. If I can move on, Paul, do you think you're satisfied with that answer for that question?
No, actually, now I read it. In a sense, the question, the essence of that is about healing. That healing is where you try and rectify things. And it's true that we're not healing the mathematics learner. We're trying to lead them forward. They don't start wrong. They don't start malfunctioning as, say, an unhealthy person does. So there is that difference. But trying to give something that's good. Yeah, I acknowledge that difference now, but I don't think it is problematic for me using that framework.
Okay, thank you, Paul. This question's from Jorge Soto Andrade. Assessment turns out to be the main obstacle to learning. Would you agree?
Assessment is a good and valuable tool. You know, there's a formative assessment, finding out what a learner has done. The assessment, the notion of warranting someone's knowledge. The problem is that the institutions of assessment have now become so powerful. I use the metaphor of the tail wagging the dog. You know, you can have all the most airy, fairy, beautiful ethical aims. Oh dear, sorry. Just put the phone under a cushion. Sorry about that. No, I've lost the thread.
The question was about assessment and it being.
Oh yeah. Assessment. The trouble is the tail wags the dog, and so assessment can be brutal. The notion that competition is woven, assessment needn't have competition in it. One of the slides I skipped, which wasn't in the chapter, was just knocking up some kind of alternative way of assessing that's non-competitive. Instead of, and I guess the key thing is criterions reference items as opposed to norm reference. A criterions reference test item is one where you have, a task is set and you perform on it and you get some of it out, or you get all of it out, fine. And you can be marked accordingly. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially, an assessment, if it properly samples, what you studied and offers tasks similar to what they think they want you to do with that curriculum, there's nothing wrong with that. But when it's norm reference, that means that the marks you get or the value of the marks you get are determined in terms of how the whole population scores. And so if they only want to give 10% of A grades out, whatever your score is, whether it's 89% or 29%, if it's not in that top 10%, you won't get an A. So even if you get 89%, that's a bit of an extreme case, I suppose, showing that you really have mastered those topics, so those questions, those sampling So for me, one of the villains is norm referencing, but there are other things too. So education assessment is a big problem, but it doesn't have to be so. It's within our grasp, although it's not that easy because the powers that be, and it ties into the whole neoliberal modern dispensation, want everything labeled, everything. I mean, in Britain, there's currently a big debate at the moment over the Ofsted, the people who inspect schools, used to give a one-word classification. Is it outstanding or good or average or needing improvement or useless or failure or whatever? And the notion that you can grade a school, the whole performance on hundreds of kids over a period of years with one of those words. And people are saying, well, yeah, you give a lot more words, but ultimately you can boil it down. The fact is that the whole conception of competing schools, that you need to profile, you need to look at different elements and decide what you can help improve. The question is, what are you doing? Trying to market them or help them grow? And the same with children. Are you trying to market children or help them grow? And if your assessment is about marketing them, then it is a big obstacle.
That's a great answer, Paul. Thank you very much. We have so many unanswered questions that have come in, but we do have to move on to the next speaker because we've got a long list to get through. But I would encourage all of you who have asked these really great questions, please send them in an email to Paul. And I can, if you're registered for the event, what I'll do is after the event, I'll send out all the authors' email addresses if you have additional questions you'd like to ask directly. And I do apologize about the time constraint here, but like Paul said, this was a huge project, a huge book. So I do want to move on to the next speaker, which is Ole Skovsmos of the University of the State University of Sao Paulo and Aalborg University in Denmark. Let's see. Let me get this. Let's do this to here. There
I
we go.
think Ula might have had to step away for a moment.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You could skip ahead if you wanted to Grace, because I know she has a firm time
Yeah.
limit.
Yes, that's a good idea. Thank you. Grace, are you ready to move up? Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Not
Okay,
to
great.
put you on the spot. I'm
No.
sorry if that was me putting you on the spot.
That's great. I
So this is Grace Chen of New York University. Grace.
great. Let me share my screen. All right. Great. Well, thank you for the introduction and the invitation, the coordination. Thank you, Paul, for putting together this book and bringing together so many brilliant scholars. And thank you all. I can't see everybody who's listening, but thank you for being here. I'm really thrilled to chat with you all today. So the title of my chapter is Choosing Cruel Optimism, What Relational Ethics Offers an Equitable Mathematics Education. And I come to this work as a teacher educator and a researcher of teacher learning who primarily does empirical work with math teachers, but I have a little bit of a side interest in contemporary philosophy and cultural studies, given that mathematics education as a contemporary cultural practice falls short of what most people who go into it aspire for it to be, like Paul was pointing out. So I think my interests are in taking these ethical questions and applying them to some of the truisms of professional practice. If we rethink the ethics of math education, or rethink, as some of the other speakers today are going to talk about, some of our onto-ethico-epistemological assumptions, what does that mean for practice and for those of us who are going into classrooms every day with children and youth? So one of the things I love about this book is the wide range of ethical theories that are addressed that the different authors use. And in my chapter, I use Judith Butler to talk about relational ethics, even though a lot of scholars, especially feminists of color, queer theorists, crip theorists, indigenous theorists, have written about similar ideas. I'm starting with Judith Butler for simplicity and because many of these folks also cite her work as well, or their work as well. One of Butler's starting assumptions is that humans are exposed and we are vulnerable. Simply by existing, we are susceptible to injury and to being addressed. And that makes it both possible and necessary for us to respond to others. And so ethics is really about learning how to respond to the fact that we are always vulnerable. But these vulnerabilities are not equal. The power means that these vulnerabilities are differentially distributed. Some people are much more vulnerable than others. And I imagine that I expand on this in the chapter, but I imagine for the purposes of this short talk, you can sort of imagine how vulnerability is differentially distributed based on power. And part of that is because of the norms, what makes us who we are, what constrains our possibilities. All of this began long before we existed. These systems of oppression, these ways of being have long enduring histories. And so the reason I find relational ethics useful is because thinking about people, power, and norms helps me think about situated and dynamic ways of being and the moment-to-moment possibilities for refiguring what is and what could be. And so relational ethics suggests that equitable practices in math ed may actually exist in a relation of cruel optimism. This is Lauren Berlant's concept. When what you desire actually impedes your ability to achieve it. So Barb Stengel has written about how what motivates teachers to enter the profession, caring for children, wanting to see children grow, wanting to see children thrive, often makes it impossible to stay in the profession, given some of the technocratic and uncaring ways that the systems of education force teachers to act. And Jennifer Diaz has written about how the idea of a math mindset as something that can be cultivated can promise equity while at the same time compromising egalitarian ideals by sorting kids into haves and have-nots, kids with mathematical mindsets, kids without. So even though the spirit is intended to help us think about all children as capable, the sort of cruel optimism of the idea is that it can also sort kids into those who are more and less. So in this chapter, I consider 3 taken for granted practices in equitable math teaching that exist in a similar relation of cruel optimism. So many teachers are drawn to the idea of equity. It's really alluring, even though we don't have a clear picture of what that looks like. And it gives us a sense of continuity in being a good teacher. But when these practices become imbued with the weight of transforming long-standing relations of power and inequity, they inevitably fall short, and our attachment to them can contribute to the attrition of thriving. So again, my goal is not to dismiss them, because I think these practices lay the groundwork for really meaningful relationships and learning and teaching. But I encourage us to understand why the things that are supposed to work don't work under compromised conditions of possibility, so that we can refine our understandings of them and do better. So the first one is getting to know your students. I don't think I need to say much about this. In math, the research tends to focus on students' identities as mathematicians and on positive math learning experiences. But when the idea of getting to know students is held up as an unquestioned good, there's a few ways in which it can become cruel. First, expecting to know students imposes a condition on the teacher-student relationship by suggesting that a teacher is only able to be effective if students are willing to surrender something personal to their teachers. A second is that students may feel coerced. They may feel like their privacy is being invaded. Kate Filippo has a lovely paper titled, "You're Trying to Know My Business," where students talk about that feeling of teachers trying to get to know them in ways that they don't feel comfortable with. And then just unknowability. Children are always changing, adults are always changing, humans are always changing. And so when we focus on getting to know students as a set of information that we can acquire, that information is always already immediately outdated as soon as we have it. So again, I emphasize that acknowledging the cruelty reveals possibilities that we might not previously have recognized or articulated, which allows us to approach the practice with more nuance. So in terms of the possibilities for getting to know your students through relational ethics, it draws our attention to ongoing practices of attention. So treating knowing as an activity rather than as a commodity. And also a sort of knowing that is situated in norms and history, and knowing who you are as a teacher and your relationships with your students. The second practice that I address in this chapter is the idea of cultivating student agency. Again, I'm not going to do a whole lot of summary here. Nicole Louie has a lovely paper that lays out how student agency has been conceptualized within math education research. But the idea is generally cultivating student agency is a good thing that we should try to do. And so here, because this, again, agency has been amply explored in philosophy and math education and social justice literature, I just focus on three ways in which aspiring to cultivate student agency in math classrooms may inadvertently lead to compromising student agency. One is the idea of pseudo-agency, which is that there is the appearance of agency, but actually there's a small set of correct choices. Or when intellectual agency is given while constricting bodily autonomy, or agency that appears to be an option for students, but actually is still constrained by the teacher. The idea of agency can uphold individualist and deficit-based views of students. This idea that teachers can give agency to their students is a sort of patronizing idea. And even Paulo Freire talked about how too much student-centeredness is a form of abandoning responsibility for teachers as authority figures who have come to be being teachers by virtue of their experiences, their age, and sort of their professional certification. And so instead, if we go back to Judith Butler, where agency is a struggle with the unchosen conditions of one's life, we can think about students as always being agentic and always responding to norms and conditions. And so our aim as teachers isn't to give them agency or find opportunities for them to exercise agency, but rather to pay attention to the agency that they are always already exercising and how often they get to choose the responses that get aligned with their desires and values. And so part of that is supporting them and recognizing their commitments, making transparent the structures of engagement so they can choose deliberately. The last thing I'll just say briefly is, again, the idea of equitable socio-mathematical norms. There's a rich and extensive literature over decades about how they support all sorts of lovely things in math education that we would aspire to for our students. But these research has also shown these norms don't always work as intended. Assigning roles can be intended to mitigate status, but instead they can restrict how students participate and what ways of participating are considered valid. They can accidentally or inadvertently reinforce the status hierarchies instead of mitigating them, and sort of ossify a particular way of being where there's a vision of idealized performance and only that kind of performance is allowed. And so instead, Alexis Shotwell encourages the idea of opening normativities. So instead of focusing on getting the norms right and enforcing the norms, we focus on normalizing heterogeneity and normalizing that which opens up possibilities. Not just particular ideas, but particular ideas that a teacher might hope students say, but encouraging notice and wonder, encouraging random assignment of groups so students can try out new ways of being. And so again, if we said these practices are cruel and abandon them because they're imperfect, I think that's giving up. I think the optimism guarantees that we will continue to work towards equity. It protects the desire for equity. And my argument in this chapter is that if we explicitly embrace the cruelty by considering these practices through a lens of relational ethics, it encourages us to reckon with important questions like what we mean by equity or justice, which risks we're willing to take and which compromises we're willing to make, and how we can acknowledge and address cruelty along the way. So here's the TLDR version of this talk and this chapter. I thank you again for being here. I would love to hear your questions and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Grace. Okay, a couple of things. We're going to take Grace's questions now, but after Grace, we're going to move all the question and answer to the end of the event. So it gives people time to formulate and write down your questions. You can type them into the chat box if you'd like. And then just note whichever author your question is for. And that way you can sort of add them to the Q&A queue, question and answer queue, as you come up with them, but then we can just address them later so you don't have to come up with it on the spot. Okay, Grace does have a conflict, so I want to get Grace's questions now. So we have one already. Okay, Grace, here we go. Is the teacher really the biggest authority figure in the context of a field which is regarded as a multi-trillion-dollar market? Teachers are also embedded within the same political economic system where they're compelled to help children pass exams and where budget cuts lead to overcrowded classrooms and contractualization of the teaching jobs, don't you think?
Yeah, I think the challenges that we're up against are certainly bigger than any one person can address. And certainly teachers are a very small part of this education ecosystem that sort of exists. And we know there are many powerful interests that don't always agree on what education should be or what is best for children or for any subset of children. But I write this chapter out of my work with teachers. I work with young people, especially particularly pre-service teachers, so young people who are really excited to get into the classroom and to work with students and to share their love of learning, their love of mathematics, and also recognize that the challenges we face in this world are broader than any one person can address alone. I don't think any single teacher is going to dismantle racism or dismantle these corporate profit games that we see in education. But our teachers still wake up every morning. They still accept too little pay to do too hard work. And my interest is in supporting them to think about what they can do and what is possible within the conditions that they're able to control.
Great answer. Thank you, Grace. Oh, yeah, I'm not muted. Okay. Okay, other questions for Grace? I got to say, Grace, I'll ask a question. Grace, how did you fall into Berlant for this? Because I like Berlant's work, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone use it in a math education paper before. So how did you sort of how did you make the connection there?
I think I first was interested in her work because I was interested in thinking about affect in math education and ways in which we might understand how the role that affect plays in teacher learning. And particularly, I tend to focus on how math teachers learn about issues of power and equity and race in particular. And I think that the process of learning and the conditions of learning are really affective and really go beyond. And I was looking for theories that went beyond sort of individualized theories of internal emotions and thinking about affect more broadly and how it conditions the possibilities for how we engage in learning and in classrooms. And so that's how I first came to Lauren Berlant. I just really enjoy her work. I find it really provocative, and I would love to see more of it in math ed because I think it offers a lot of insight in just sort of adding some complexity to paying attention to some of the, I think math ed sometimes historically as a discipline still tends to focus pretty psychologically on how we understand learning to happen. And so for anyone else who's interested in thinking about affect theory and math education, I would love to chat further.
Thank you, Grace. We have two questions I'm gonna lump into one because they're sort of related, and then that'll be it for now. And again, like I said earlier to everyone, I will send out for everyone that's registered. We have like 300 and almost 400 people registered. So I'll send out all of the email addresses for the authors so that if you have a question that didn't get answered, you can shoot them an email and continue the conversation. Okay, the last question for Grace. Thinking about feminist movements and how they've been able to affect change over the years, what are some common inequitable practices that teachers should organize in a sort of feminist way to achieve change?
Question. I think I think Rochelle Gutierrez's work really informs my thinking about this question. And also, I just started teaching. Our semester just started yesterday, as I imagine many of yours may have as well. And my new group of pre-service teachers, we started talking about some common sense in math education and some sort of what Paul was calling ideologies in math education. And many of them grew really heated at these memories of the timed tests they used to have to take in math. Either the like multiplication mad minutes they saw in elementary school, or even in secondary education. And now as they're taking university math courses, the idea that your thoughts are only valid if they can be produced in a particular amount of time. And I use that as just one example of like an inequitable and I think dehumanizing practice. And I think about the ways in which teachers certainly can individually resist in their own classrooms, but also have the power to sort of to advocate among their colleagues and often have conversations with parents or with family members about the kinds of education that how the math education they may have experienced may not actually, there are reasons we're trying not to replicate that and trying to do something different. And I'm here in New York City right now where there's a lot of parent organizing both to, I think on both sides of the issue, both to enact and enforce selective screening and admissions and to continue the COVID-initiated pause on selective screening. And so I think teachers can certainly, just as one of many, many possible concrete examples, participate in those, testify at those school board meetings and participate in conversations around why selective screening and sort of tracking and honors programs tend to constrain opportunities for particularly our most marginalized students. But I would argue that they're contribute to these damaging ideologies for all math students, even those who are identified as being quote unquote better at math.
Thank you, Grace. I agree that organizing is important. Okay. Thank you very much to Grace Chen of New York University. Grace, it's good to see you. And we're now going to turn to Oli Skovsmos. Oli is here. I'm going to share Oli's screen. Let me just get this closed. And now we're going to do share and this. And okay. Oli, take it away. Am I sharing the right screen here?
Perfect.
Perfect. There
I'm
we go.
here.
There we go. Good.
The title of my chapter for the book is Mathematics is Indefinite, an Ethical Challenge. I'm not going to make a summary of my paper, but I'm going to raise or emphasize 3 points. The first point is a turn in the philosophy of mathematics. And Paul has already referred to this turn in the philosophy of mathematics. It's important to be aware of ambiguities related to modernity. The modernity is a long period, stretching hundreds and more hundreds years of time. It includes scientific discoveries, also brutal colonizations, racist worldviews appeared. More welfare seemed to be created. There was industrialization, which combined with exploitations of workers and their families. Modernity includes wonders as well as horrors. Many times, modernity has been celebrated. It includes wonders and horrors. And it's important to be aware that science and mathematics, science included mathematics, there are different ways of saying this, science and mathematics are involved in all such wonders and horrors. There is big ambiguities related to mathematics. During modernity, mathematics became located in an ethical vacuum, what I refer to as the modern philosophy of mathematics, which includes logicism, formalism, intuitionism, other positions as well. But the modern philosophy of mathematics developed the ideas in all technical details. It's impressive, the technical details. But the same modern philosophy of mathematics treated mathematics as an isolated phenomenon, not involved in anything, not involved in any ambiguities, not involved in any ambiguities of modernity. It was treated as an isolated phenomenon. the modern philosophy of mathematics contributed to a deification of mathematics. It got a status, a godlike status. They positioned mathematics in an ethical vacuum. It is important to a philosophy of mathematics to recognize how mathematics, for the good and for the bad, is involved in all features of life. I really want to emphasize for the good and for the bad. It's involved in many things. It's involved in horrors and wonders of modernity. This constitutes an ethical turn in the philosophy of mathematics. One needs to be aware of this complexity of involvement of mathematics. It constitutes an ethical turn in the philosophy of mathematics. And now I come to my second point, because it is important to think a bit about the notion of ethics, because this is used in many ways and could very well be used in very many different ways. What I have in mind when I talk about the ethical turn, it is reflections on the social impact of doing mathematics. Broad reflections, or thinking about these conceptualizations of the social impact of doing mathematics. The ethics that I have in mind concerns reflections on the scope of mathematics brought into action. What are we doing? What are we misunderstanding? What are we doing in a problematic way? How are we using mathematics? How are we misusing mathematics? All this is addressed by ethical reflections. I also include reflections on the social formation of mathematics. So when I talk about ethics, it is this scope of reflections I have in mind. It could well be there are many other reflections or thinking that is important for an ethical turn in the philosophy of mathematics. I'm not trying in any way to say it's only this. I only want to say it is this, and it may be much more. It could be. There exists an intimate relationship between actions and ethics. Whenever one is doing something, it could be different. One needs to think, what am I doing? Or one needs to think, what is done? If it's not my personal action, but other actions, what is happening here? What is the impact? Mathematics-based actions demand ethical reflections. It demands ethical reflections. And it's good to be aware. I talked about horrors and wonders, but this is just an extreme simplification. Mathematics-based action can be praiseworthy, problematic, cynical, benevolent, generous, helpful, horrific, insignificant, risky, dangerous, useful, and I'm sure one could contain for a while here. There could be all kinds of qualities related to mathematics-based actions. They need to be addressed, and to address these scope of possible qualities is an ethical concern. It's an ethical task. The third thing, and the final thing I want to emphasize, is an ethical challenge. We need to get out of the ethical vacuum. Reflections on bringing mathematics into action is crucial for any mathematical practice, being in research in pure mathematics, research in applied mathematics, and education. Practices in research, application, and mathematics need to get out of the ethical vacuum. This constitutes an ethical challenge to any such practice. For the philosophy of mathematics education, now I switch. I've been talking about the philosophy of mathematics, but for the philosophy of mathematics education, it is important to face the ethical challenge. It is important to engage in an ethical turn. One can see the ethical turn in the philosophy of mathematics, and it's very much related, integrated with the ethical turn in the philosophy of mathematics education. In the book, Ethics in Mathematics Education, the good, the bad, and the ugly, shows important ways of facing the ethical challenge. For me, this is an extremely important book, and it has been a pleasure for me to be invited to contribute to the book. And it's a pleasure for me to see the book. It's a very important contribution to the ethical turn in the philosophy of math education, to the ethical turn in the practice of mathematics education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ole. Okay, stop share. Okay. Thank you, Ole. Next speaker we will have is Natalie Sinclair from Simon Fraser University in Canada.
Can you see that?
It's coming. Yep, there we go. Got it.
Okay, super. Okay, so let me begin. You introduced me, Alex, but I also wanted to say that this chapter I'm going to talk about today is co-authored with Kelly Payton, who's on Zoom here today. So I won't talk about I, but I'll talk about we. And I wanted to thank you, Alex, very much for organizing this book launch, bringing us all together here. It's kind of special that we're from all corners of the world engaging together on this very important topic. It requires a lot of work, a lot of labor, and a lot of love, I think. And thanks to Paul for leading this book project, for bringing together such a diverse set of authors. And Kelly and I are really delighted to be a part of it. So, oh, and thank you to the audience too. So the problem that Kelly and I tackled in our chapter is the following. What becomes of ethics in math education if we take the ontological, the epistemological, and the ethical to be co-implicated, as I hope this Escher image shows. So we see this as an investigation that is kind of doing the work of what if not? What if we saw these things otherwise? And in line, I think, with a great essay by Whitehead on mathematics and the good, which I highly recommend, on how it is that mathematics can give us these opportunities to think differently and pursue the consequences of those differences for what they might afford, and especially to get us out of our normative ways of thinking. So when I say that they're co-implicated, it means sort of very specifically that a mathematical concept can't be separated from how we know it or learn it, and cannot be separated from the aesthetic values or ethical obligations that are entailed. So if we say that a concept is material, for example, as Liz de Freitas and I have argued, that's an ontological claim. And it means it has consequences for learning. It means that learning will involve material experiences as well. And that precludes an aesthetic or ethics of a static, pure, aestheticized mathematics, much like Paul was talking about, and also Ole. So the notion of onto-ethico-epistemology arises from the work of feminist physicist and philosopher Karen Barad. In quantum physics, one does not know what a photon is until one measures it. For Heisenberg, this was an epistemological matter that humans simply don't know or don't know yet. But for Niels Bohr and for Barad, the very nature of the photon is indeterminate. It only becomes determinate through a measuring process that involves a certain apparatus, in the case of the two-slit experiment, or the device, and it involves scientists and their discourses and values. So photons are not only indeterminate, they are material discursive concepts. This is an ontological matter, which has repercussions on how we might come to know a photon, i.e. epistemology, and how we relate to photons, i.e. ethical, because we are part and parcel of its becoming and not separate from it. So instead of thinking in terms of interactions, how two entities relate to each other, Barad will coin a new word called intra-action, which names this ontological assumption. So because intra-action is very fundamental to the ontology that we're interested in pursuing, I want to just give you a diagram or a visual to think this intra-action. So typically we think of two different agencies or entities as being separate, and we're interested in education, in classical ethics, in looking at their relation. What kind of relation do they have? This can be teacher-student, it can be teacher-tool, it can be student-student. But the point is that we take these two things as ontological primitive, these two entities, and then we look at their relations. So for Barad, what she's thinking of is focusing on the relation as the ontological primitive. So it's the relation that exists first, and out of that relation, the entities arise. So in words, the neologism intra-action signifies the mutual constitution of entangled agencies. That is, in contrast to the usual interaction, which assumes that there are separate individual agencies that precede their interaction, the notion of intra-action recognizes that distinct agencies do not precede, but rather emerge through their intra-action. So we can think in terms of, instead of all of those dots and the lines that connect them, which appear in an enormous number of visuals that we use in math education, we like to think in lines instead, and this also arises from the work of Tim Ingold. So one implication of this view, and this is central to the feminist politics, is that the self is no longer an intact subject defined by pre-existing properties, but is dispersed or diffractive through time and being. As the image suggests, with its multiple lines, each one being produced in a given material discursive interaction, with past and potential ones all there too. Barad will think the ethical in terms of touch, those touching lines, the touching of the self, that the way in which we are co-implicated in every interaction. I want to highlight two important things that are particularly relevant to this ethics, and those are multiplicity and virtuality. Multiplicity, in every interaction, a new we is produced, an us is produced. We can think of these lines as all of the us's. And for those of you who do work in racial politics or intersectionality, I invite you to think about how different that ontological view is if we take all of those lines as being the multiple us's that become. The virtual, importantly, every interaction produces a difference. The proton becomes a wave, for example, and it could have become a particle. However, that which it did not become, the particle, is also real. It has a status of the virtual. This is important because it's a way of attending to the differences that could have mattered. For feminists, for example, the male-female difference is one that came to matter historically as a fundamental division of labor. But there are other differences that could have and might still been made. Tall, short, for example. In mathematics, the conceptual and the procedural is a difference that has been made and has come to matter. But there are very many other differences that could have been made and yet be made. I particularly like, and in reference to Ole's talk, the Dionysian and the Aristotelian. Are we looking for order or are we looking for chaos? This point is central in the philosophy of immanence, such as Whitehead and Deleuze and Guattari. We are not only in a relational ontology of the actualized, but also of the virtual. So in our chapter, in our exploration of what these ideas of Barad could mean, we decided to engage in a diffractive reading of both the writings of Luis Radford and Rochelle Gutierrez. This diffractive reading we see as a method, and we emphasize that it isn't about some kind of dialectical working out of which point of view is better or how they cohere. This is a method of making differences that produce new ideas, while recognizing that the way in which these ideas are grounded in their assumptions. And these assumptions cannot be decided as being stronger than the other. So we work with Radford and Gutierrez as a way of better understanding our own assumptions. So for Radford, and this is a table in our chapter, the focus of ethics is on the teacher-student relationship. He advocates for a communitarian ethics that sees the teacher and the student engaged in joint labor, which tempers the usual hierarchy of the teacher-student relationship. So he will speak of the importance of responsibility, commitment, and care as features of this relationship, here drawing on Levinas's ethical theory, that is one of lived experience and not just one of moral grounding. For Gutierrez, the putting oneself in the shoes of others is central towards what she will call a reciprocity. And her ethics will also fundamentally involve not just the teacher and the student, but the more than human as well. Thinking about how that reciprocity operates both metaphorically and actually, drawing from indigenous ideas. For Barad, the relationship that both Radford and Gutierrez talk about is conceptualized as an intra-action. Individuals are infinitely indebted to each other by fact, not by choice. This has two consequences, at least. One is the injunction of becoming aware of this indebtedness, which shifts attention from substantialist assumptions about people and things. And I think this echoes nicely what Grace was talking about in terms of agency. There is already agency there, so we don't have to impose it. The other is recognizing mathematics as part of this infinite indebtedness. It is not just an object of learning or a subject of aesthetic pleasure, but part of the mutual constitution of agencies, part of who we have become. As I said in the beginning, the chapter aimed to address the problem of what a Baradian ethics might look like in math education. So the answer can't be about solving problems that have been formulated with different ontological assumptions. So unlike the interpretation of our chapter that's in the afterword, we aren't really calling for a more joyful mathematics. Instead, we're asking new questions. So one of these questions could be, how might teachers and students encounter each other, not just as they are actualized through whatever category we might think of, but how they might yet become as multiple us's. What forms of indebtedness produce and are produced by mathematical concepts? How are we indebted to the tools we deploy, the compass, the straight edge, the paper, to the senses we use, to touch, to sight, to sound? What might learning mathematics entail if the human is no longer the sole doer of mathematics? So you can see in the image I have here, the pufferfish who creates that beautiful pattern at the bottom of the sea, which he can't see actually. So what ethical questions come about if mathematics is something that happens at the bottom of the sea? And finally, what new mathematical concepts would emerge if the aim of math education was to care for the earth? So if we consider, would we consider concepts that are that could disrupt the tidy stability we have created to produce predictable nature? Or would we opt for mathematical concepts that can express more inclusive images of nature? Images that affirm distinctive exceptions, ambiguities that Elise Cosmose talked about, and also multi-scale patterns. This last question isn't one that we posed in our chapter, but arises from our continued work that has been influenced both by the work with Elizabeth de Freitas and some new attention to the socio-ecological that is being done by Alf Coles and Kate LaRue and many others. So in this vein, if we're extending the ethics beyond the classroom, beyond individuals, in an onto-ethico-epistemological approach, there's also no ignoring the scale of the ecological. And this image, which comes from a book called Terra Forma, which I highly recommend, offers a way of thinking these relations as kind of spatial imaginary that shows not only relations across humans, relations across the more than human, which often happen sort of at the phenomenological level, but relations with the geological, not just as layers beyond the scale of the human, but as similarly iterative, like a fractal. The relations at the subatomic level are similar to ones at the classroom level and to ones at the planetary level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And we'll take questions for Natalie in the Q&A box that we'll answer at the end. So please put them there if you have them. Next up is David Bowers from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville.
Y'all, you're not going to get a PowerPoint from me. Aesthetically, one of the things that I need to do in order to be maximally coherent with my chapter is I need to put forth my full humanity. So engaging with me as an entire human being is fundamental to what I'm asking you to do here. So with that in mind, greetings, y'all. I am delighted to be here with all of you today to discuss our chapter, Reconstructing the Heart of Mathematics Education, Ethics as First Philosophy in Research and Praxis. When Merve Kursov, Emmanuel Ntiasante, and Catherine Westby and I first sat down to discuss our chapter, we already knew broadly what the silhouetted outline of our chapter would look like. We knew what our daily experiences had communicated to us, that our field at all levels, pedagogy, research, service, daily practice, tended to eschew attention to axiology in general and ethics in particular. We knew that this tendency had profoundly shaped how we experienced our field and how our field experienced us. We knew the keenly felt contradiction of being desired or even fetishized for our diverse perspectives and experiences while being simultaneously rejected for those same differences, like being invited into what seems at first to be a warm embrace, but in fact turns out to be a stranglehold about our necks. We knew the regular experience of having faculty, peers, or teachers who would extend an invitation to critique with one hand while holding a knife behind their back with the other. We knew, in short, that we wanted to argue for ethics as first philosophy, and we knew that our respective lifetimes of living the ontological contradiction of being desired, craved, consumed, and abhorred had led us to that goal, seeking to imagine and build an ethics-first approach to all that we do. Now, what we didn't fully realize at the beginning was how much articulating the former piece was going to require articulating the latter. With that in mind, my aim in this short talk is to introduce some uncomfortable tensions that we explore in greater depth in this chapter. At least some of these tensions you will recognize in yourself or in others that you love. And I need you to sit with that discomfort and not run in fear from it. We move differently in this world when we refuse to set aside the pain of complicity. So, in our brief time here, I'm going to limit myself to offering three main ideas that trace the contours of our chapter. First, you have no uncompromised access to objectivity. Second, many of the things that we treat as separable categories, such as ethics and aesthetics or research and practice, are actually deeply entangled. And third, those who partly do the work of learning to be more equitable and social justice minded can actually become more dangerous to the marginalized than those who don't do the work at all. Proceeding in order. You have no uncompromised access to objectivity, and our field's hegemonic dreams of objectivity represent a flattening of humanity into something simpler than what we are, i.e., pursuing or dreaming of objectivity sans subjectivity isn't the pursuit or dream of understanding, but instead it is a pursuit or dream of dehumanizing oversimplification. You forever occupy an onto-epistemic space that is dialectically comprised of both subjectivity and objectivity, and veiling the former doesn't make it disappear. Having the capacity to discover or construct objective truths would require minimally that we begin with an onto-epistemology that gives us access to that. So although there are a lot of ways for arguing why we don't have full access to objectivity, here's one. You, the person who is selecting or building an onto-epistemology, already have an axiology which acts as the foundation for your onto-epistemic choices. You already have beliefs and assumptions about what counts as knowledge, what counts as valid research, what sorts of questions are worth asking, what sorts of approaches can we take in answering those questions. You've already spent decades being enculturated into multitudinous social spaces, and you've accrued countless conscious and unconscious values and hierarchies that shape your answers to these questions. You are not objective. And that is very human. It's part of what makes you wonderful and messy and beautiful. You are not objective, but if you acritically try to be, then you are engaging in active dehumanization and oppression. Second point, many of the things we treat as separable categories, such as ethics and aesthetics or research and practice, are actually deeply entangled. In a sense, this is a straightforward expansion of my first point. Just as the colonial, white, abled, etc. tendency to compartmentalize everything silently calls upon us to imagine objectivity on its own without subjectivity, so too does it demand this same oversimplification in many spaces. Just like with objectivity and subjectivity, acritically caving to this oversimplification requires flattening humanity into something that isn't quite human anymore, i.e., it is dehumanizing. Consider ethics and aesthetics two categories of values that axiology subsumes under its realm of consideration. We all have ethical values regarding research and teaching. However, in daily practice, we rarely judge things directly based off of those ethics. Instead, we tend to rely on an aesthetic judgment. Researchers are expected to produce good research, and we have consciously and unconsciously held notions of what good research looks like. Relatedly, we're expected to participate in peer review and editorship to support others in the production of good research. And again, those aesthetic notions guide us. Researchers are expected to educate and enculturate good emerging researchers, and once more, those aesthetic notions guide how we feel about those emerging scholars and how we think we should conduct themselves. In every aspect of our practice as researchers and pedagogues, our internalized aesthetics of goodness guide us. Our ethical and aesthetic notions of good are not just entangled, but they're collapsed into something less specific and more intuitive. One major byproduct of that aesthetic operationalization of good is that the familiar becomes tautologically good and the unfamiliar becomes tautologically bad, or at least less good. Thus, even in the midst of calls for greater diversity of research and researchers, we find ongoing marginalization of any difference that disrupts the current normal. For example, as Emmanuel, who's in the audience, observed, if you consider Afrocentric research, which centers the perspectives, folkways, mores, and spirituality of African cultural groups, you run into a challenge. Such knowledges and perspectives are unfamiliar to the hegemonic center, so choosing to follow that Afrocentric path virtually guarantees fewer invitations to work, less recognition, less ability for your work to be understood by others, more critique, and fewer publications. In short, many of us nominally value such work and find great enjoyment in pushing for an aesthetic of non-disruptive diversity within our programs, within our teaching, within ourselves, and so forth. We seek a diversity that only exists at the surface level and does not disrupt underlying systems of expectation. However, our embodied practice necessarily runs deeper than that surface layer, and it often does not share that value. Our de jure valuing of social justice is contradicted by our de facto practice. Finally, third, those who partly do the work of learning about equity and social justice can actually become more dangerous to marginalized minds and bodies than those who don't do the work at all. There's a parallel here to be made with many of the observations marginalized scientists have been sharing for decades now, apropos their interactions with those who there are many observations marginalized activists have been sharing for decades now, apropos of their interactions with those who fully embrace conservatism or regressivism, as compared to liberals who nominally embrace progressivism, such as Malcolm X, who famously observed, "The white conservatives aren't friends of the Negro either, but at least they don't try to hide it. They are like wolves. They show their teeth in a snarl that keeps the Negro always aware of where he stands with them. But the white liberals are foxes who also show their teeth to the Negro, but pretend that they are smiling. The white liberals are more dangerous than the conservatives. They lure the Negro, and as the Negro runs from the growling wolf, he flees into the open jaws of the smiling fox." Martin Luther King Jr. shared much the same sentiment in his letter from a Birmingham jail, as have all manner of other Black, Indigenous, disabled, and queer activists. Now, in this chapter, we explore several archetypes of mathematics education faculty which resonate with this notion of foxes. Given our limited time here, I'm going to limit myself to one example. Consider someone who is hyper-specialized in just one or two spectra of marginalization, but who has not attended much to the others. For example, they know a lot about race and gender, but not much about disability. This researcher is at times sincerely enacting the full dialectic of ethical praxis within their context, and the extent to which this kind of person has positively impacted the lives of people who fall within that precise context is immeasurable. However, the moment that context changes, such as when it extends to intersections that are still invisible to this faculty member, the same sorts of dangers represented by the fox are introduced for bodies which don't fit within their praxis. For several of us, the authors of this chapter, researchers like that present an even more immediate danger than the wolves, exactly because they are better at seeming safe, like an abusive relationship with someone who's learned therapy speak. Because it can be even more difficult to help them see the ways in which they are not safe, because it can become thrice difficult to express the danger they represent to colleagues or authority figures who actually do have bodies and minds that fall within the limits of that person's praxis. That brings me to roughly 10 minutes. Love and solidarity, friends. I look forward to any questions, expansions, or connections you might have.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for the questions. I'm making a note of all of them that come in here, so keep them coming. Thank you, David Bowers. Wonderful talk. And I saw Emmanuel on the attendee list. Hi, Emmanuel. Good to see you. And I can't remember if Merve or Katie is here, but anyway.
Merve was here earlier. I don't know if she still
All right.
is.
Hey, Merve. Okay, so next we've got Yasmin Abtahi, and I've forgotten which university you're at. Is it Southeastern Norway or? Yeah, okay. Yasmin Abtahi, University of Southeastern Norway.
Thank you so much. In my head, I was the last person, so I need to fetch my PowerPoint.
No worries at all. No worries at all.
Thank you.
We did have to reorganize things a couple times, so.
Perfect. So thank you very much for this, for the book launch, and for all the nice conversations we are having. The way I've organized my talk is really around a few words, but I go about looking at them in such a way that shows how I see them connected together. My chapter, chapter 14 is the ethics of mathematical knowledge, imagination and empathy to produce social and ecological solidarity. So first, my central thought and the consequence of my thought. The central thought of my thought while writing this chapter was that there is more to our relationship with mathematics than just teaching and learning it. Ultimately, learning mathematical knowledge is not just, learning mathematics is not just about the knowledge, but it is what we do and the kind of decisions we make on the basis of that knowledge. So as a consequence, I had a question, and that is, just by the knowing of mathematical knowledge and through the decisions I make with that knowledge, would I become ethically responsible for the humans and things I'm in relation with? So then I have two words here, ethics and decisions. So I will talk about my ethical stance first, and then I will talk about making good or ethical decision. I've said my ethical stance multiple times. So this is a verse 700 years old from a Persian poet, Sadi. And it says, we are members of a whole, in creation, one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. And from this 4 tiny sentences, I see interconnectedness in being member of a whole, empathy in understanding others' pain, discomfort in becoming uneasy, and solidarity in remaining uneasy with the pain of others. So this is my ethical stance. And now in the rest of this chapter, I really just played with these vocabularies, with these words. So now I think, how does our mathematical knowledge become vital, not only for understanding our interconnectedness and interrelationships, but also for making decisions in the context of social and ecological solidarity? So for Rorty, the best answer to question of how to make better decisions is that individuals become aware of more alternatives. The source of these new alternatives is the human imagination. So it's the ability to come up with new ideas rather than the ability to get in touch with an unchanging essence. And this was important to me because, to me, getting to know mathematics seems a little as to getting in touch with unchanging essence. And it, in terms of the way the curriculum is organized, or in terms of the way assessment is organized, it's more of, it's a thing of an honest, unchanging essence, and we are teaching or learning it to get in touch with it. So it took me away a little bit from what kind of alternatives. So then my question was, How does our knowledge of mathematics make us aware of more alternatives, and why that is important? Why is it important to be aware of more alternatives? And this gets me to the question of solidarity, which includes empathy and imagination. Becoming aware of more alternative is necessary to be able to stand in solidarity with others, humans or non-humans. And for Rorty, solidarity is not discovered by reflection. It is created. That means we actually need to do things to create solidarity. He explains that solidarity is achieved not by inquiry, but by imagination. It is created by increasing our sensitivity to the particular details and pains and humiliation of others, unfamiliar sorts of people. And that for me is empathy. But there are two things. One is having empathy is difficult. And second, having empathy is not enough. In having empathy is difficult, which is the thing I really think about and don't have an answer for it. Like, how do we nurture empathy, or how do we teach through mathematics the idea of empathy? The reason I'm thinking about it is because I have two examples. One is I watched the conversation between Edward Said from Palestine and Daniel Barenboim from Israel, in which Edward referred to a character of Daniel as a rare human character. And he said, Daniel is able to understand the suffering of others. And I thought, is that a rare human character? And if so, how do we nurture it? The second story that I am grappling with in terms of having empathy is actually very difficult, is coming from my reading of the ancient Persian story of the Tales of 1001 Nights. And it seems that we need to hear 1001 stories need to be voiced and heard so that we could foster or nurture our sense of empathy. It's just the second point about empathy is not enough. So the trees and the ants and the bees and the turtles whose lives and sufferings we see or imagine do not want our empathy, they want justice. So there is a gap between empathy and the ethics of assuming any responsibility to act. And I was thinking about this gap as I think David also referred to it as the discomfort. It's the discomfort, it's our own state of discomfort and the decision we make as to how to deal with it. David said, don't run away from your discomfort, keep it so that we could use it. And I think also that discomfort is an inseparable element of acting in a hope for a better future. So I see discomfort and hope sort of together. And the reason for that is a story that I like to share. This story is told by Munir in Munir Fash's paper in 2000. I am just retelling it. I am going to read it because I think it shows this discomfort very nicely, and I like it. So, in a dusty road in India, there sat a beggar who sold cocoon. A young boy watched him day after day, and the beggar finally talked to him. Do you know what beauty relies within this chrysalis? I will give you one so that you might see for yourself. But you must be careful not to handle the cocoon until the butterfly comes out. The boy was enchanted with the gift and hurried home to await the butterfly. He laid the cocoon on the floor and became aware of a curious thing. The butterfly was beating its fragile wings against the hard wall of the chrysalis. Until it appeared, it would surely perish before it could break the unyielding prison. Wanting only to help, the boy swiftly pried the cocoon open. Out flapped a wet, brown, ugly thing, which quickly died. When the beggar discovered what happened, he explained to the boy, in order for the butterfly wings to grow strong enough to support him, it is necessary that he beats them. It's necessary that he beats them against the walls of his cocoon. Only by this struggle can his wings become beautiful and durable. When you denied him that struggle, you took away from him his only chance of survival. And then Monir says, may the walls of your cocoon be just thick enough to allow you to struggle just long enough to emerge a beautiful person I already know you to be. This story for me exemplifies the connection between discomfort, the struggle, and hope for the emergence of a better future, and discomfort in breaking the barriers to ethically assume responsibility. And these barriers could be the personal beliefs we cherish, the comfort in being comfortable, the state of numbness, I'm referring to Nussbaum, or the ignorance for that matter. So I finished the chapter asking 4 questions and giving mathematical example for each of the questions. I'm sorry, I could have actually done this. So how mathematics as a system of knowledge helps us and our children to voice and hear stories, so to have empathy in understanding the nuances of experiences of those who are suffering, to understand the narrative that sustained the injustice, so then to try imagine alternatives, to reflect on the hope encapsulated in taking responsibilities and in action, and also to be willing to push to be uncomfortable. Voila. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I'm going to get ready for mine. And again, please put questions for Yasmin in the Q&A. You already have one, so I'll keep it for the end. Okay.
It now falls to me to introduce Alex, who's been our host throughout this afternoon, or morning, sorry, morning for many of you, well, throughout this session, who's kindly been our host, not only as an MC, but also whose institute, I hope you all know about the CPPI, studying marginal philosophical and psychoanalytical ideas in maths education, with a wonderful journal. Anyway, it's now his turn to speak to us and to share his chapter.
Thank you, Paul. So my chapter is called The Pathology of Mathematics Education, and it is in part 4 of the book, which is the ethical critique section when you're looking at the table of contents. So theoretically, it's kind of a dense chapter. I'm going to try to get through enough of it to get the point across. But if you have questions afterwards, just email me. So I'm going to define some terms first. Jouissance is the French. It's sort of translated into English as enjoyance, which isn't really a word. Enjoyment is sort of closest, but it's not really a good translation of the word. It's just sort of the best one we have. So I'm going to use enjoyment in this talk. But it refers to a sort of a pain or pleasure or excitation stage, situation. If you can kind of think about all of those terms as an idea together, that's what jouissance is. Desire, the way I'm defining desire following Lacan is that desire is desire for itself. It's caused by a lack, which means that there is sort of a negative existence that is causing desire, that creates desire or leads to desire. And so that's really important to think about, that what you're desiring is sort of this negative, desire is sort of this negative aspect, not necessarily a positive aspect that we always think about it only positive in our popular sort of use of the word. Sublimation is the process of making something seem more socially acceptable, specifically in the capacity of seeming less ideological. Normally, when we talk about ideology, it's sort of a bad thing, right? Ideology is a negative thing. Ideology is there regardless of whether we think it's good or bad. So it's sort of like sublimation is the sort of the getting to be okay with ideology, and you do that simply by sort of not seeing it anymore. So the more that you sublimate, the more that you enjoy, and that's how you sort of get away from seeing your own actions that are within ideology itself. I would say that there's no position that's outside of ideology. So if if that's not clear, then there's sublimation going on. A good example that I use a lot that Lacan uses is viewing an art piece in a museum. You can stand in the middle of the room and look at the art piece, as the artist intended, where it's way over there and you get the whole margin and everything. Or you can go stand right next to the wall and look and stare right at it, an inch away. Well, if you stare at it an inch away, you're going to probably see a lot of the technique that the artist used, right? You're going to see the brush strokes and so on and so forth, but you're not going to be able to appreciate the piece of work. You're not going to get the emotional response to the whole thing. So stepping back in the middle of the room, that's the sublimated view. You're enjoying it, but you're not really seeing the technical aspects of how it was made or how it was put together. And then ethics I define specifically as transactional in the Lacanian sense. This is this transaction of you're sublimating and you're paying for it by getting more enjoyment. It's sort of a negative payment because you accumulate more as a result of that. But it's the same kind of a transactional thinking about your ethics. You're doing something, but you're also getting something out of it for doing it. So that's how I look at it in the chapter here. A few Lacanian maxims. There's tons of these, but I like them. So desire is the only truth. That's a good one. I always speak the truth, not the whole truth, because there's no way to say it all. There's always more to say, and even when you do say something, you're not really getting the truth. The words fail. That's what Lacan says. Words literally fail. So there's always more signifying to do. And I'm going to try to tie this into signifying. I just mean speaking or using language or articulating, making a sign of your ideas, things like that. So the key aspect here is that signification gives us enjoyment. And you can think of this as like what we say or what we do or what we say, kind of the same thing, indicates what we are enjoying. Not necessarily by the manifest words themselves, but by what is repeated, by the fact that it is repeated. And this repetition is a big part of the argument that I'm making here. What does this have to do with mathematics? I'll get back to the repetition in just a second. So there exists a non-empty subset of subjects who would like to see mathematics survival. For example, us here today, right? It's regardless of our perspectives or whatever, we are interested in mathematics. We would like to see mathematics continue in some way, even if it's just for our own doing or, whatever, but we are advocates for mathematics, maybe not in the public school sense or, the standardized sense, but we are advocates for mathematics in some capacity. That leads to the question of why should we teach it? There's lots of reasons. There's lots of perspectives, lots of reasons. Usefulness, beauty, social credibility, etc. Those are all documented in the literature. In terms of psychoanalysis, that would lead us to wager that the main reason for this specific enjoyment, the main reason for teaching mathematics is the enjoyment that it brings. So let's go back to how we were defining enjoyment: pain, pleasure, excitation. I somehow have two of the same slide. I didn't even notice that. Okay. So let's bring these ideas together: mathematics, sexuality, language. Okay. In psychoanalysis, sexuality is a core concept, and so is language. We connect the two in Lacanian psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis. We connect the two by saying that speaking is sexual because speaking involves the repetition of language or the repetition of signification, and that is the same enjoyment as the sexual enjoyment. And further, Baldino and Cabral, who are here today, I think I saw them in the list. Hello, y'all. Good to see you. Baldino and Cabral even called for investigating mathematics education specifically from the perspective of enjoyment. So I'm going to try to do that with this chapter. And the connection of mathematics here is that mathematics is a signifying speech. So when we're doing mathematics, speaking, writing symbols down, whatever, talking about mathematical ideas, how we know things because of mathematics, these are signifying speeches. But what is mathematics is an age-old question. For example, the notion of the equal sign. Well, this it directly leads us into the notion of psychosis in psychoanalysis, because it's sort of it's a failure of the symbolic law of the symbols, of the language we use to talk about things. It's a failure of that then sort of we assign authority onto the equal sign as meaning that this signifier is equal to this signifier. You know, think about any kind of expression, x squared plus 4x. The meaning of that is not contained within the signifiers themselves. It's contained within the way that we talk about it. So that's a psychotic structure, but it can also be thought of as the thing, which is, I think of as the cultural construction. The thing is like the non-object, the primordial non-object. It's characterized by its notness. So thinking about mathematics, it's an age-old question because we really can't answer it. From the psychotic side, let's trace the paths of enjoyment here now. From the psychotic side, the enjoyment is we suffer, but mathematics enjoys. And from the side of the thing, the enjoyment is we enjoy, but mathematics suffers because we are excessively signifying what mathematics is or trying to. Since there's enjoyment going in two directions here, think of it as a dialectic. These two enjoyments can't really be separated into two parts or poles. The idea together is a circle or a spiral that where the two enjoyments constitute each other. And it's sort of, I like to think of it this way. It doesn't really make sense to conceive of one without the other, right? So hence it's a dialectic. This is the same as the sadomasochist's enjoyment. And hence the pleasure and pain, social signification of mathematics makes sense. So think about what happens in class, right? Students are writing things, students are signifying, teachers are signifying. Everybody's trying to signify. And whenever we're signifying, we're trying to engage in a process of metonymy, of metonymizing ourselves through combinations or strings of signifiers. And this is what we mean when we talk about becoming who we are, or becoming a better version of ourselves, or identifying, articulating an identity that we have, anything like that. We are metonymizing ourselves through the use of signifiers. So I argue that human subjects have a right to this because we are linguistic. So you have a right to signify. And so that is where the ethical conundrum, I think, makes mathematics education so interesting, because at its core, I believe education should be about emancipation, or at least developing critical consciousness. Students got to be in a safe structure in order to do that. And they got to really believe that the teacher loves and supports and cares for them, so that they can articulate their own desire. So this is my final thought. Take a notice here between the difference between philanthropy and love. I'm really poking at in this chapter how we tend to confuse the two, or use the two as empty signifiers, especially love. A lot of times we're just talking about philanthropy. A lot of what we do as researchers is based in philanthropic motivations. But since emancipation involves truth, then considering the ethics of mathematics education, we must look at love separately than philanthropy, because love sort of privileges the social link, thinking about what you would do for the sake of the other person and this kind of stuff. And so I think that would shift our field from having such a focus on knowledge to having a focus more on labor, and to some of the other authors' points in here, the relationships between the actors involved in mathematics education. But also for me, it really comes down to a question of, what am I enjoying by doing this mathematics? What are students enjoying? And I mean that in the jouissance sense of the word. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for listening to me sort of ramble on about psychoanalysis for a few minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. And as before, we'll say, put your questions in writing to Alex, and then at the end, and he's about to resume chairmanship, he can then go through them. So back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Paul. Let's see, wait a minute, I've got screen issue real quick. And our last talk is, come on, close this, please. Come on, there we go. Now we're good. Zoom. Talk about a love-hate sadomasochistic relationship. This was Zoom. Okay, our next and last author is Alexander Peisch, who I've had the privilege of working with for a few years and who trained me in my dissertation. Very good friend of mine, and I'm very, very excited to have him here for the final afterward talk to summarize the whole book. So, Alexander, take it away.
Thank you, Alex. It's nice to see you again. Thank you, David, and Paul for organizing this event. And I mean, I want to especially thank to Paul for having inviting me to write the chapter for this book, but especially for giving me the option to choose either to write a chapter on ethics, which was the first proposal, and I immediately showed a lot of reluctance in doing so, because when I listen to ethics, it resonates with very negative feelings that I have. Because working in universities for the last 10 years or so, for me, ethics, it's a set of bureaucratic measures and protocols that hamper and limit the work of the researchers. So I immediately say, I don't want to have anything to do with ethics. I don't know anything about ethics. But then Paul suggested that instead of writing a chapter on ethics, I write a chapter doing a kind of an appraisal or a critique of the different chapters. And that I enjoyed very much, because that is how I work in maths education. I'm not in the business of developing grand theories or presenting new concepts or pedagogies, methodologies, etc. Great names of the field have been done that very well. But I do like to intervene and to engage with the work of people. So it was really nice of Paul to allow that opportunity to me. In my chapter, which I invite you all to read, because I will not go through the kind of arguments I developed here, but I try to show the contradictions that emerge from the different chapters, which by themselves are very sound and robust academic chapters, but when taken as a whole and even within themselves, you can notice important contradictions that I highlight in my paper. Here, I mean, I will be very brief, and I just want to call attention to two kind of approaches to ethics that I felt come out very strongly. One is how I conclude the paper, is this idea that the ethics that people are talking about in these different chapters are very much an ethics of conformity, of being aligned with certain ideas, especially the idea of good. This idea of good is an idea that transpires throughout all the chapters. This idea that ethics is about good, that we researchers know what the good is, and it is our job to kind of dictate that good to teachers, to politicians, etc., etc. And the different authors, they feel very safe in this idea of good. I mean, I said that I don't care about ethics, but because I study Lacan, and Lacan is a very important book on ethics that I read many years ago, I do know a few things about the philosophy of ethics. And one of the things I know very well is that ethics, when it appears, it doesn't look good. It looks evil. That is what history shows us. Any ethical character is it always poses a threat to the mainstream, to what is acceptable as good. We can talk about all the anti-colonization heroes who fought for anti-colonization. They were all seen as evil against the background of what was acceptable at the time. So my first question to us all is, maybe we are not looking in the right place for ethics. Maybe we should look somewhere else, in instances where ethics manifests itself as evil. And if we look at the world today, it's not difficult to show instances of that evil. Maybe that's where ethics is today. And the other is, this morning I was reading the latest paper from Baldino and Cabral, that I have the privilege that they share that with me. It will be published in Paul Ernest journal. And they talk about the silence that is produced through our work. And indeed, there is an ethics of silence at play here in the way that we have been talking about ethics. I don't know how you feel, but I do know that many people here are placed within the political dimensions, social dimensions of mathematics education. And this has always been in my DNA. I mean, from the moment I was a teacher, first in schools and then in universities as a researcher, I never was able to disconnect what I was doing with politics. And by politics, I mean what's going on in the world today, the concrete conflicts that are going on. And in that respect, it's a very interesting world, because there is lots of conflicts, and many of them evolving in ways that can easily cause dramatic changes to the way we have been living and the way we are positioning ourselves in the world. So that political dimension, for me, it's very natural to discuss that within the context of mathematics education. But it's not always easy. I mean, there are places where those issues are just sidelined, they are just, I would say, censored. But there are also places who are supposed to discuss these issues, but when it becomes too hot, when it becomes really concrete about taking decisions in particular conflicts, then no, that's too much. That's too much politics. Let's keep us with our beautiful mathematics. Don't get too much messiness here. And we do that. We create that silence about the politics, not by being quiet. We create silence by talking a lot, by doing lots of research about all kinds of stuff in order to avoid addressing what really matters. For instance, we do thousands of pages of research on assessment without referring to the credit system, which is something that I found truly amazing, given that this is research that it comes as back to the late 80s, the 90s. But it's such a painful reality to live in that we prefer to ignore it. Dozens of thousands of social and political turn without referring to surplus value and the way schools are involved in the production of surplus value in the production of the qualified labor power. Lots of talk about immigration, more general, without referring to the exploitation, sanctions, invasions, bombings, coups, and puppet governments implemented by Western countries in Asia, Africa, and America. We can talk about the war between Ukraine and Russia without talking about NATO. We can talk about the war in Palestine without talking about genocide. And we can write a whole book on ethics without talking about all these concrete problems. So that, for me, shows a little bit the state of ethics today in mathematics education. But silence, and just to finish, I mean, silence, it doesn't last long. And sometimes, I mean, these problems are so acute and so strongly posited that some voices do crack up and they see some light. And this is the case of the paper, the chapter from Darcy House, which I was very pleased to know that he was here today, but apparently he couldn't make it. He is the only paper in the whole book that actually addresses the concrete problems of teachers and students in schools. No wonder that Darcy is himself a teacher. He's the only teacher in the book. And I was wondering now, I mean, if there are some teachers that work in schools that actually teach mathematics, I wonder, after 2 hours of listening to our talks, I wonder how does that resonate with their work, if they find this talk meaningful at all. Thank you.
Yeah, I was muted. Thank you so much, Alexander. That was awesome. Yeah, great question. And it's a really good afterword that ties together the whole book, and I think leaves us with some good questions to keep asking. That's it. And we're 6 minutes over on time, but I'm going to switch to the Q&A now. We've got 4 questions in the queue. I'm just making sure I'm looking at everything here. Okay. Yes. Okay. This is for Yasmin. I'm passionate about imagination and creativity. My question is, if imagination is linked to empathy, interconnectedness, and solidarity, is it an emotional construct, or is it a cognitive construct?
I am actually trying to think either way, how does it change how we look at it? It's a good question. And I don't think about things in terms of, is it now tapping in my cognitive stuff, or is it tapping on my emotional stuff? I see them as a whole tapping me with all bits of me all together. So this, is it emotional or is it cognitive, is not something that I would think about, I guess, but I am curious to know how it would change your thinking, whoever is asking the question. So how is it important to you? Yes.
Yanalim, I hope I'm saying that okay. If you want to answer in the chat box.
Or if you like to, we could talk over email. That's
or even email.
Yeah, both are okay with me.
I can also allow them to talk if you want them to say it out loud.
Here we go. You can unmute yourself. There we go.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to meet you all. I enjoyed your presentation, and I will continue my conversation via email. So I will email you and we'll discuss more about the issues about imagination and creativity. Thank you.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Oh, this one is for me. Oh, actually, let's do it. Do the second one for Yasmin also. Can empathy include the act of making others uncomfortable? If we seek to make the world a better place for all, we need to confront the big oil and weapons companies, for genocide and carbon emission, et cetera. The least we can do as academics is organize an academic boycott of Israel. But most math ed researchers often travel to, quote, Israel for conferences, et cetera, including many who write about social justice. So here's the question. Is empathy acted on the individual level only?
Good question. Embedded in so many political stuff. I don't see empathy as acted only in an individual level. Well, and again, I as a person, when I feel empathy, that is me, a person, me as an individual feeling the empathy towards. Now, whatever that I feel empathy towards is not necessarily an individual. It could or could not be an individual thing. I feel empathetic for what is happening in Gaza, and not much I can do about it, but I'm horrified by it, and I feel so. As an individual feeling the empathy, I feel the empathy. As it what it goes to, it could be an individual or not an individual. Again, that's a question that we could definitely talk about it through a conversation, or think about it through a conversation.
Thank you, Yasmin. This one is for David, and then there's one for well, actually, I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess, David, this is for you. This is from Liz DeFreitas.
Yeah, so part of that's going to be hidden from you in the answered section because I wrote a little text answer to some of it. But let me really quickly verbally summarize our exchange.
Okay.
So Liz DeFreitas, who you already heard Natalie Sinclair mention earlier today, she asked me something to the effect of, do you really think objectivity is the problem? And I don't think it's the problem. And Liz is pointing to the fact that we've made a lot of sort of cultural progress in some sense. There is at least a sub-community of math ed researchers that is no longer so taken with that. And so is it still a major problem? Here's part of my answer to that. And this is necessarily a very abbreviated, very partial answer. So I don't think objectivity is the issue, but let me give you a lived experience example of why I contend that it remains a really substantive, meaningful part of the ongoing violence we experience. Applied behavior analysis. So I'm autistic, very autistic, diagnosed as a child, special education, pull-out classes, not necessarily someone who was expected to get a PhD and wind up doing the kind of work I'm doing. I was a heavily nonverbal autistic child. In the United States, the only type of autism therapy that most insurance companies will cover is called applied behavior analysis. And this is an approach that its form was designed by the same body of people as the people who designed conversion therapy, the torturous way of trying to get, gay and queer people to not act gay and queer anymore. But in the context of autism, it's instead used to get autistic people to not act autistic anymore. And nowadays, when I'm talking to researchers in this space or therapists in this space, a lot of them are fully unaware that a huge swath of the autistic community describes these practices, even the versions that no longer use corporal punishment and electroshock and stuff. They describe these approaches as abusive or torturous. They're not even aware of this. Instead, they are only aware of a body of research they've been exposed to, which claims that in objective terms, this is a therapy that changes the behavior of autistic people. And so this is a case where objectivity is being rhetorically weaponized as a way to avoid a deeper interrogation. So that's a component of the exchange we were having, but Liz and I could, talk about the notion of objectivity for hours. So that's a good enough for now thought.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, and the last one, this is for me, but I'm gonna follow up on this on an email. If that's okay with you, Marina. The connection, the question is about the standpoint of labor rather than knowledge in mathematics education. I have some readings I can refer you to and so on and so forth, and we can just talk about it. But the idea is that, in our educational institutions, the main idea is in our educational institutions, they function as a credit system. And so then there is, the passing and the failing splitting moment. I'm going to use Roberto and Tanya's term because they're here today and it just came to mind. The splitting moment between who passes and who fails. There's a lot of there's a lot of labor critique that goes into that kind of a thing. So I can refer all of that to you. And I think that clears everything up that I had on the list here. Yes, Marina, thank you. Got your email address. I'll send you an email. Yep, I think that's everything. Yes. Okay. Thank you all. We're 15 minutes over, but I hope that's okay. Well, I've really enjoyed this. I just want to turn it over to Paul to say any last words about the book. But thank you all for being here. And the recording will be on our YouTube channel later at some point when I can get it uploaded. So there's that. And thank you all again for coming, giving us a few hours of your time. Paul, final words.
Alex, thank you so much. And, and your colleagues and, Dave, for, the other side of the screen, all the background stuff. And that's great. And I've really enjoyed this afternoon. Well, for me, it's an afternoon. Because not only have we been exposed to the diversity of perspectives, and there really is a lot of diversity, there's even more in the book. And it's a shame that we couldn't, Darcy House was due to speak, but he was actually teaching kids. So that's why he couldn't come. That's as good an excuse as anyone has. So the diversity of perspectives was really interesting, but also, and I take this partly from Alex Pace, the notion of self-critique, the notion that, we need to be critical about what we're doing, that, especially when you're talking about ethics, you're on very thin ice in some way, because, certainly I, as an academic, enjoy many privileges that 95% of the world don't. And to sit here and pontificate about ethics, the good life, while there are these, as that question said, there are terrible conflicts, there are terrible, all sorts of things going on, which I can, let me just say, we have adverts on TV in Britain for charities that either help children in Africa get the water, or make people less blind, or, help donkeys. And all the time they show you these images, these sad, terrible images of suffering. And it's helped to numb me, I mute the sound. I don't want them to intrude into my life with their tales of suffering. And, it's an ethical dilemma, isn't it? Choosing who you want to empathize with, choosing where you cut it off. And I think, so we're raising some uncomfortable issues here, which is something that's come up more than once. I loved Alex asking us, why do we fetishize the good? Why do we take it as and is ethics always good? I mean, I think there's so much more. So in a way, this book is the opening of a box, and there's more thought and stuff for us to do. And by the way, any people who would like to have contributed on this and who weren't invited to contribute to the book, and given that there are hundreds here at this event, then that's an awful lot, do feel free to submit for my journal. You can find details online if you search my name, because we do like to encourage submissions from teachers and all sorts of people who are interested. But then let me just end by saying thank you very much. I didn't even notice we were over time. I thought we had until 6, but of course my easy arithmetic, 6 my time, sorry, the hour. So now I'm extending it even more. So thank you very much. It's been a great joy joining you, and it's been a great joy being involved in this project. So thank you all.
And I'll just say thank you to all the other authors who were here today, and everyone in attendance as well, who are reviewed or wrote for the book, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you all.
Love and solidarity, y'all.